"You don't belong here," Richard Whitmore said, not loudly, but with the kind of quiet certainty that made the entire room obey him as if it were a rule written into the walls. The sentence didn't echo, but it didn't need to. It landed, heavy and final, and the soft hum of conversation inside the Grand Regent ballroom thinned into something fragile, something watchful, like air before a storm. Crystal chandeliers cast cold light across polished marble, catching in the rims of half-raised champagne flutes and the glossy surface of silver trays. And for a brief second, every movement slowed. Forks paused midair, heels stilled against the floor, eyes turned not toward the billionaire who owned the night, but toward the woman he had chosen to erase. Naomi Carter stood 3 feet away from him, a serving tray balanced steady in her hands, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, as if the words had not struck her at all, as if they had simply passed through her like wind through glass. The black fabric of her uniform caught the light in faint, quiet folds, and a thin name badge rested just above her heart, its letters small enough that no one had bothered to read them twice. Around her, guests in tailored suits and evening gowns shifted their weight subtly, not stepping back, but not stepping forward either, the space between them and her widening without anyone acknowledging it. Richard adjusted the cuff of his jacket, a precise, practiced motion, as if dismissing her was no more significant than straightening a sleeve, his gaze already drifting past her, already moving on, because in his world, things that didn't belong simply disappeared. But Naomi didn't move. Her fingers remained still beneath the tray, steady despite the weight, despite the attention pressing in from every direction, and her eyes, calm and level, lifted just enough to meet his, not challenging, not pleading, just present. A faint clink sounded somewhere to the left, a glass touching another glass too quickly, too sharply, and then silence folded back in again, thicker this time, as if the room itself was waiting to see what she would do. Near the far end of the hall, a man in a Navy suit, Daniel Reeves, though few noticed him yet, tilted his head slightly, his gaze narrowing not at Richard, but at Naomi, as if something about her didn't fit the role she had been placed in. Naomi shifted her weight by less than an inch, the movement so controlled it was almost imperceptible, and the tray in her hands reflected a thin band of chandelier light across her wrist, where a faint indentation from an old watch strap marked her skin. "I was invited," she said, her voice even, not raised, not sharpened, just clear enough to exist, and that was what changed the air. Not defiance, not emotion, but the simple refusal to vanish. A few heads turned again, quicker this time, curiosity threading through the discomfort, and somewhere behind Richard, a woman's expression faltered, her certainty slipping as she glanced between them. Richard let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh, though it carried no humor, only dismissal, and he took a small step closer, enough to reclaim the space he believed was his presence filling it with the quiet pressure of authority. "Then whoever invited you made a mistake," he said, smoother now, more controlled, as if correcting an error rather than confronting a person, and the words settled over the room like a final decision. Naomi didn't respond right away. She lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in thought, and the faint reflection on the tray shifted again, catching the edge of her badge for a split second before the light moved on, the letters there too small, too overlooked, too easily ignored. Around them, the guests held their breath in different ways, some out of habit, some out of caution, some out of something they didn't yet recognize, and the music playing softly from the string quartet in the corner seemed suddenly distant, as if it belonged to another room entirely. Naomi lifted her eyes again, not to argue, not to explain, but simply to remain where she was, and in that stillness, something subtle began to change, not in her, but in the people watching, in the way their attention lingered a fraction longer than before, in the way one or two of them began to look not just at her uniform, but at her face, as if searching for something they had missed. And for the first time that night, the certainty in the room didn't feel as solid as it had a moment ago. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, stretched, and shifted in small, uneven ways, like a surface beginning to crack beneath pressure that no one had acknowledged yet. A server passed behind Naomi with a tray of sparkling water, the faint fizz audible in the glass bottles. But even that ordinary sound felt out of place, too loud against the weight that had settled over the room. Richard Whitmore had already turned slightly, his body angled away from her as though the moment were finished, as though her presence had already been resolved into nothing. Yet his eyes flicked back once, briefly, not out of doubt, but habit, the reflex of someone used to being obeyed. Naomi remained where she stood, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, the tray still balanced in her hands with a steadiness that suggested long practice, not just in service, but in holding still under pressure that was not meant to be questioned. A woman near the front, wearing a pale silver dress, leaned closer to the man beside her and whispered something that did not quite form into words, her gaze moving from Naomi's face to the badge at her chest, and then back again, as if trying to reconcile two images that refused to align. Across the room, Daniel Reeves shifted his stance, his attention sharpening now, his brow tightening as recognition moved from instinct into certainty, and he took a slow step forward, not enough to draw attention yet, but enough to close the distance by a single foot. Naomi lowered the tray onto a nearby table with a soft, controlled motion, the metal edge meeting the linen with barely a sound, and for the first time since Richard had spoken, her hands were free, resting loosely at her sides, not defensive, not rigid, just present. The movement, small as it was, pulled a few more eyes toward her, and the subtle shift in posture changed the balance of the scene in a way that could not be named, only felt. Richard noticed it too, though he did not show it directly. His jaw tightened by a fraction, his shoulders squared, and he turned back fully now, reclaiming the space with a measured step forward, his voice lowering as if to contain the situation before it grew beyond his control. "This is a private event," he said, the words smoother than before, but edged with something firmer, something meant to end the conversation rather than continue it. Naomi did not step back. She did not interrupt. She simply listened, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and that lack of reaction began to draw a different kind of attention, one that did not belong to spectacle, but to curiosity. Daniel moved again, this time more decisively, weaving between two guests who instinctively shifted aside without realizing why, his eyes fixed on Naomi now, not on Richard, not on the tension, but on her, as if the rest of the room had faded out of relevance. "Naomi," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the name carried, cutting through the controlled tone of the evening like a thread pulled loose from fabric. Several heads turned at once, faster this time, the name landing where silence had been, and Naomi's eyes flickered toward him for the first time, recognition passing between them in a brief, quiet exchange that said more than any explanation could. Richard's expression changed, just slightly, not yet doubt, but irritation sharpened by interruption, and he glanced toward Daniel with the faint impatience of someone unaccustomed to being redirected. "Do you know her?" he asked, the question clipped, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent that suggested the answer should not matter. Daniel did not respond immediately. He took one more step forward, closing the distance until he stood within a few feet of Naomi, his posture straight, his attention unwavering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something different from the rest of the room, not hesitation, not performance, but certainty. "Yes," he said, his gaze still on her, "I do." The words settled into the space between them, and for a moment, nothing else moved, but the silence that followed no longer belonged to Richard, and that difference, subtle as it was, began to shift the weight of the room in ways that could not be undone. The word lingered longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because of who had said it and who had heard it, and for the first time that evening, the room did not immediately return to its carefully managed rhythm. Daniel Reeves did not look away from Naomi as he spoke, and that alone began to redraw the invisible lines that had separated her from everyone else just moments before. A faint shift moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable, as if a current had changed. Direction beneath their feet, and several guests who had been watching from a distance now leaned in slightly, their attention no longer divided. Richard Whitmore's expression tightened at the edges, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that something had slipped beyond his control, and he straightened his posture as though reclaiming authority through precision alone. "Then perhaps you can explain why she is here," he said, his tone measured, each word placed carefully, but carrying a quiet insistence that the situation be corrected. Daniel did not answer right away. He took another step closer to Naomi, stopping just within arm's length, his presence steady, his gaze direct, and in that brief pause, the silence shifted again, no longer empty, but charged with expectation. Naomi met his eyes with the same calm she had held since the beginning, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, yet the recognition between them settled into place as something real, something that could not be dismissed with a sentence. Daniel exhaled slowly, then turned his head just enough to address Richard without fully giving him his attention, a subtle change that did not go unnoticed by those watching. "She is here because she belongs here," he said, his voice even, not raised, but carrying a clarity that reached the far edges of the ballroom. A murmur moved through the guests, soft at first, then building in small, overlapping whispers, as if the room itself were testing the weight of his words before accepting them. Richard's jaw set, and he let out a controlled breath, the kind that signaled restraint rather than agreement. "You are mistaken," he replied, smoother now, but firmer, his eyes returning to Naomi as though she were still the center of the problem rather than the shift that was unfolding around him. Naomi did not respond to either man. She stood as she had before, grounded, composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides. And yet the way people were looking at her had begun to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be felt. A man near the bar lowered his glass without drinking, his attention fixed now on Naomi with a new kind of focus, while a woman beside him tilted her head, studying Naomi's face as though searching for confirmation of something she had only just begun to suspect. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, his movements unhurried, deliberate, and when he pulled out his phone, the faint glow of the screen reflected briefly across his fingers. He tapped once, then held it at his side, not yet revealing what was on it. But the gesture alone carried weight, suggesting that what came next would not be based on opinion. "You might want to reconsider," he said quietly, his tone unchanged, but now edged with something firmer, something that suggested certainty rather than suggestion. Richard glanced at the phone, then back at Daniel, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something less controlled in his expression, not fear, not yet, but the early trace of doubt pressing against the confidence he had relied on. Around them, the room had shifted again, the earlier discomfort replaced by a sharper kind of attention, one that leaned forward rather than away, and the distance that had once separated Naomi from the rest of the guests had narrowed almost completely, not through movement, but through recognition that had not yet been spoken out loud. Naomi remained still in the center of it all, not stepping into the moment, not claiming it, but not retreating either, and in that quiet steadiness, she became impossible to ignore, not because she demanded attention, but because the truth surrounding her was beginning to surface, piece by piece, in a room that had finally started to see what it had overlooked. The glow from Daniel's phone did not command attention at first, but the way he held it, steady and unhurried, created a quiet center that drew the room in piece by piece, until even those at the edges found themselves watching without realizing why. Richard Whitmore's gaze lingered on the device for a fraction longer than before, his confidence still intact, but no longer untouched, and the slight tightening in his expression suggested that he understood, at least instinctively, that the balance had shifted in a way that words alone could not reverse. Daniel lifted the phone just enough for Richard to see, angling the screen so that its light caught across the polished surface of the nearby table, reflecting upward in a thin, pale band that brushed against Richard's sleeve. "Take a look," Daniel said, his voice low, controlled, not confrontational, but certain, and that certainty carried more weight than any raised tone could have. Richard hesitated for the smallest measurable moment, then leaned in, his posture still composed, his movements deliberate, as though engaging with the screen was a choice rather than a necessity. His eyes moved across the display, scanning quickly at first, then slowing, and something in the set of his jaw shifted, not dramatically, but enough that the change could be felt by those closest to him. Around them, the room held its breath again, but this time it was not out of discomfort or avoidance. It was anticipation, the kind that builds when something unseen is about to become undeniable. Naomi stood just beyond the reach of the light, her face calm, her gaze steady, not fixed on the phone, not fixed on Richard, but present in a way that suggested she already knew what was there, already understood the impact it would have. Daniel lowered the phone slightly, not removing it, just easing it back into his own space. And in doing so, he shifted the moment from private recognition to public consequence. The strategic recovery plan for Whitmore Capital, he said, his voice carrying now, not louder, but clearer, reaching farther into the room, was authored and executed by Naomi Carter. The words landed with a different kind of weight, not sharp, not sudden, but heavy and steady, like something long buried being set down in plain view. A ripple moved through the guests, no longer whispers, but fragments of recognition connecting in real time, and several people turned toward Naomi with a new intensity, their expressions changing not out of politeness, but realization. A man near the front stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her, then at Richard, then back again, as if aligning details that had previously existed without context. Richard straightened slowly, his gaze lifting from the phone to Daniel, then to Naomi, and for the first time, the control he had maintained showed a visible fracture, small but unmistakable. "That is not possible," he said, his voice still measured, but lacking the effortless certainty it had carried before, the words sounding more like an attempt to restore order than a statement of fact. Daniel did not respond immediately. He reached forward and placed the phone on the table beside Naomi's tray, turning the screen outward so that others nearby could see, and the light from the display reflected across several faces. At once, illuminating names, signatures, dates, details that did not require interpretation. One by one, those closest leaned in, their eyes scanning, their expressions shifting in real time, and the murmur that followed was no longer uncertain, it was grounded, informed, and growing. Naomi did not step forward to claim the moment. She did not gesture toward the screen or speak to confirm what was already becoming clear. She simply stood, her presence steady, her silence unforced, allowing the truth to move through the room on its own. Richard's gaze returned to the screen once more, then lifted again, but this time there was no immediate response, no quick correction, only a pause that stretched just long enough to reveal that the foundation beneath his certainty had begun to give way. And in that pause, the room no longer belonged to him in the way it had before. The shift did not announce itself with a single moment, but with a series of small, undeniable changes that moved through the room like a quiet tide, pulling attention away from where it had always been and placing it somewhere new. The screen on the table continued to glow, its lights steady and indifferent, while the people gathered around it leaned closer, their earlier hesitation replaced by a need to see for themselves, to confirm what had already begun to settle in their minds. A man in a charcoal suit adjusted his glasses and bent slightly at the waist, his eyes scanning the document with a focus that excluded everything else, and beside him, a woman who had not spoken all evening let out a soft breath, her hand rising to her chest, as if steadying something internal that had shifted without warning. Richard Whitmore remained standing where he was, but the space around him had changed, not physically, but perceptually, as though the center of gravity had moved a few feet away and he had not yet followed it. His posture was still upright, still controlled, but the stillness now carried effort, not ease, and his gaze, when it moved across the faces in the room, no longer commanded immediate alignment. Naomi Carter did not move toward the table. She did not step into the circle that had formed around the screen, and yet the attention of that circle remained anchored to her, returning again and again as if drawn by something that no longer required explanation. Daniel Reeves stood slightly to the side now, no longer the focal point, his role in the moment already complete, his expression calm as he watched the realization unfold in others rather than forcing it further. A low murmur built again, but this time it carried clarity, not confusion, individual voices threading together into fragments of understanding that overlapped and reinforced one another. "That is her name," someone said quietly. "It is right there," another replied, and the confirmation passed from one person to the next, not as gossip, but as fact. Richard's eyes flickered back to Naomi, and for a brief second, something unguarded surfaced, not yet an apology, not yet even acknowledgement, but the first true awareness that the narrative he had imposed no longer held. He took a slow breath, as if recalibrating, as if searching for a position that would restore the order he was used to, but the room did not wait for him to find it. A woman near the front stepped away from the table and moved closer to Naomi, her heels soft against the floor, her expression no longer distant but attentive, and she inclined her head slightly, a gesture small enough to be missed, yet clear in its intent. Others followed, not in a rush, not in a line, but in a gradual shift that repositioned them around Naomi rather than around Richard, and the effect was subtle yet complete, like a lens turning until the focus snapped into place. Naomi met their eyes when they reached her, not seeking validation, not deflecting it, simply receiving the change without altering herself to match it, and in that steadiness, the contrast between what had been assumed and what was now visible became impossible to ignore. Richard remained where he stood, the distance between him and the center of the room now measured not in feet, but in recognition, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, not because he intended it to be, but because the room no longer carried it the same way. "If that is the case," he began, the words slower now, more deliberate, "then there has been a misunderstanding." The sentence lingered, incomplete in its impact, and no one rushed to accept it. No one moved to restore the balance he implied. Naomi's gaze held steady, her expression unchanged, and she did not respond, not out of defiance, but because the moment no longer required her to speak. The truth had already entered the room, and it was moving on its own, reshaping the space, one quiet realization at a time, until the place where she stood was no longer defined by where she did not belong, but by the fact that she had always been exactly where she needed to be. No one moved to correct him, and that absence of response settled into the space more heavily than any objection could have, leaving Richard Whitmore standing in a silence that no longer supported him, but simply existed around him without allegiance. The faint hum of the air system returned, barely noticeable before, now threading through the room like a reminder that time had not stopped, even if the moment had shifted beyond recognition. Naomi Carter remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and yet the way people stood in relation to her had altered in ways that could not be reversed by a single sentence. The woman who had stepped closer earlier now spoke softly, her tone careful, not out of fear, but respect that had formed without instruction. "I have read that report," she said, her eyes on Naomi, not on Richard. It was the only reason the firm stayed solvent last quarter. The statement was not dramatic, not amplified, but it carried across the room with a clarity that reinforced what had already begun to take hold. A man near the table nodded once, almost involuntarily, his gaze shifting between the document and Naomi, as if confirming a memory he had not connected until now. "The language in that strategy," he added quietly, "it was precise, efficient, different from anything we had seen before." Each comment did not build noise, but structure, layer by layer, until the narrative that had once been assumed began to dissolve under the weight of recognition. Richard's shoulders remained squared, but the certainty that had once defined him now had to be maintained, held in place rather than simply existing, and the effort showed in the slight tension along his jaw, in the way his eyes moved more deliberately as he searched for a point of control that no longer presented itself. He glanced toward Daniel Reeves, as if expecting intervention, but Daniel did not step forward again, did not redirect the moment, allowing it to unfold without guidance, as if the truth now belonged to the room itself rather than to any one person. Naomi's gaze moved slowly across the faces before her, meeting each look with the same quiet steadiness, and in those brief exchanges, something shifted further, not in volume, but in depth, as if the room had begun to understand not just who she was, but what had been overlooked in the act of dismissing her. A server passed along the far wall, careful, almost hesitant, as though aware that the balance of the evening had changed, and even the soft clink of glassware seemed to carry a different tone, less incidental, more aware of the moment it existed within. Richard inhaled again, deeper this time, and when he spoke, the words came more slowly, measured not just for clarity, but for impact that he could no longer assume. "If there has been an error in how this was presented," he said, choosing each phrase with precision. Then it can be addressed appropriately. The sentence attempted structure, attempted resolution, but it did not reach the room in the same way his earlier words had, and the difference was unmistakable. No one stepped in to affirm him. No one shifted back toward his side of the space. Instead, the attention remained where it had settled, anchored to Naomi, to the quiet truth that required no reinforcement beyond its presence. Naomi did not respond immediately. She let the words exist, let them pass through the air without interruption, and then, with a calm that did not seek to challenge, she spoke, her voice even, steady, and clear. There was no error, she said, not raising her tone, not sharpening her delivery, simply stating what was already evident, and in that simplicity, the final layer of uncertainty gave way. The room did not react with shock, but with understanding, a collective recognition that settled into place without resistance. And in that moment, the shift was complete, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, leaving Richard no longer at the center of the room, but at its edge, where authority without truth could no longer hold its ground. The words did not echo, but they settled with a finality that no one attempted to interrupt, and in the quiet that followed, the room seemed to adjust around. Naomi Carter, as if recognizing a center it had previously ignored. No one rushed to fill the silence, and that absence of noise carried its own weight, heavier than conversation, more revealing than reaction. Richard Whitmore remained still, but the stillness now belonged to someone recalculating rather than commanding, his gaze shifting once more across the room, searching not for agreement, but for alignment that no longer returned to him. The distance between him and the others had not grown physically, yet it felt wider, defined now by what they had come to understand rather than where they stood. Naomi's presence remained unchanged, and yet everything around her had altered, the air near her no longer neutral, but attentive, as if the room itself had leaned in without moving. A man near the center cleared his throat softly, not to interrupt, but to anchor himself, his voice low when he finally spoke. "We reviewed that recovery plan in the last quarter meeting," he said, glancing briefly toward the table, then back to Naomi, "and it outperformed every projection." His tone was not defensive, not uncertain, simply factual, and that clarity added another layer to what had already been revealed. A woman beside him nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful, as though replaying details she had overlooked. "The restructuring timeline," she added. "It was unusually precise. We all noticed it." The conversation did not grow louder, but it deepened, each voice contributing not noise, but confirmation, until the truth no longer needed introduction. Richard inhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders remaining squared, but the effort to hold that posture now visible in the tension along his frame. He looked toward Naomi, not past her, not through her, but directly at her, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow to that single line of sight. "If that is so," he said, choosing each word carefully, "then why were we not made aware of your role sooner?" The question did not carry the authority it once would have. It felt instead like an attempt to understand a structure that had shifted without his approval. Naomi did not answer immediately. She allowed the question to settle, her gaze steady, her breathing even, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm it had held from the beginning, unchanged by the shift around her. "Because I was not the one presenting," she said simply, her tone neither defensive nor sharp, just clear, and in that clarity, something deeper surfaced, not accusation, not resentment, but truth without embellishment. A faint pause followed, longer than the ones before, as the implication moved quietly through those listening, not forced, not explained, but understood. Daniel Reeves remained still, his attention on Naomi, not intervening, not reinforcing, allowing her words to exist on their own. A few guests exchanged glances, subtle, thoughtful, as if seeing a pattern that had been invisible until now, and the recognition that followed did not come with outrage, but with a quieter, more enduring shift in perception. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in denial, but in the realization of something he had not accounted for, and for the first time, his response did not come immediately. He stood in the center of a room that no longer revolved around him, surrounded by people who were no longer waiting for his direction, And in that space, the absence of control became more apparent than any loss he could name. Naomi remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her presence steady against the changing current. And in that steadiness, the final contrast became clear, not between power and weakness, but between assumption and truth, between being seen and being overlooked. And as the room continued to shift in quiet alignment with what had been revealed, it became evident that the balance had not just moved, it had been redefined, leaving behind a silence that no longer belonged to authority, but to understanding. The question did not demand an answer, but it uncovered something that had been sitting beneath the surface long before this evening, something that did not belong to a single moment, but to a pattern that no one had paused to examine until now. The room held that realization quietly, not as a shock, but as a slow alignment of details that had once existed separately, now forming a clearer shape. Naomi Carter stood unchanged at the center of it, her posture still, her presence grounded, as if she had already moved through this understanding long before anyone else had caught up. Richard Whitmore's gaze lingered on her, searching for something that would restore the structure he was used to, a justification, a correction, a reason that would place the moment back within his control, but none appeared, and the absence itself became its own answer. A faint sound of glass being set down echoed from the far side of the room, followed by a quiet breath, as if someone had just decided to pay closer attention rather than look away. Daniel Reeves shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not intervening, but watching with a focus that suggested the next part of the moment did not belong to him anymore. Naomi's eyes moved briefly across the faces around her, not seeking agreement, not measuring reaction, but acknowledging the presence of people who were now seeing something they had not seen before. "It was never hidden," she said after a pause, her voice even, unhurried, carrying clearly without force, and the words did not challenge anyone. They simply existed, simple and precise. A few heads tilted, not in confusion, but in recognition of what she meant, and the silence that followed her statement felt different, less uncertain, more reflective, as if the room had shifted from observing to understanding. A man near the edge of the group exhaled softly, his gaze lowering for a moment before returning to Naomi, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quieter tone than before. "We saw the work," he said, almost to himself. "We just did not look at who it came from." The sentence did not accuse, did not defend. It simply named something that had been overlooked, and in doing so, it settled into the room with a weight that did not need reinforcement. Richard's expression changed again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the realization had reached him as well, not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual awareness that could no longer be avoided. He adjusted his stance slightly, a movement small enough to seem incidental, yet it marked the first time he had not occupied the space with certainty, but with consideration. His voice, when it came again, was quieter, not because he intended it to be, but because the room no longer carried it in the same way. "That may be," he said slowly, "but presentation matters." The words hovered, attempting to reclaim a structure, a framework that could restore balance, but they did not land with the same authority as before, and the difference was unmistakable. Naomi did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to exist, to pass through the space without interruption, and then she spoke again, her tone unchanged, steady, grounded. "Clarity matters more," she said, and the simplicity of the sentence cut through the room with a precision that no elaboration could improve. The effect was not loud, not abrupt, but it was complete, and the quiet that followed it carried a new kind of weight, one that did not belong to tension, but to acceptance. Around them, the guests did not shift back, did not return to their earlier positions, and the subtle alignment that had formed remained in place, anchored not by influence, but by understanding. Richard stood within that space, no longer at its center, his presence still significant, but no longer defining, and for the first time that evening, he did not speak again immediately. Naomi remained where she was, her expression calm, her posture steady, and in that stillness, the room found a new balance, one that did not depend on authority to hold, but on truth that no longer needed to be proven. The words settled into the room with a clarity that did not invite debate, and for a moment, no one attempted to reshape them, No one stepped in to soften or redirect what had already taken root. The quiet that followed was not empty, but full, layered with recognition that moved through the guests in small, deliberate ways, each person arriving at the same understanding from a slightly different angle. Naomi Carter remained still, her presence unchanged, yet the space around her felt different now, not just attentive, but aligned, as if the room had recalibrated itself without instruction. A faint shift of fabric, the soft slide of a shoe against marble, the subtle lift of a glass that was never brought to the lips, all of it carried a new awareness, as though even the smallest movements had become part of a moment that mattered. Richard Whitmore stood within that same space, but the way it held him had changed, no longer reinforcing his position, no longer responding to his presence with automatic deference. He exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a fraction of a second before returning to Naomi, and when it did, it carried something different, not authority, not dismissal, but a careful consideration that had not existed before. The distance between them was the same, measured in a few feet across polished floor, yet it felt altered, defined now by what had been revealed rather than what had been assumed. A man near the back stepped forward slightly, his expression thoughtful, his voice low but steady when he spoke. "We built our projections on that framework," he said, not looking at Richard, but at Naomi, and it held under pressure in ways nothing else did. The statement did not raise tension, it anchored it, grounding the moment further in fact rather than perception. Another voice followed, quieter, almost reflective. "We all signed off on it," a woman said, her gaze moving briefly to the document on the table, then back again, but none of us asked the right questions. The admission did not carry shame, but awareness, and in that awareness, the shift deepened, moving beyond recognition into something closer to accountability. Richard listened, not interrupting, his posture still controlled, but no longer commanding, and when he finally spoke, his voice had softened in a way that was not rehearsed, not strategic, but natural to the position he now occupied. "Then that is on us," he said, the words measured, but lacking the edge they once carried, and the sentence settled differently than his earlier ones, not as a correction, but as an acknowledgement. Naomi's gaze met his briefly, not holding it, not challenging it, simply receiving the shift for what it was, and then moving on, her attention returning to the room rather than to him alone. Daniel Reeves remained to the side, his presence steady, observing rather than directing, as if understanding that the moment had already moved beyond intervention. The string quartet resumed its place in the background, their music soft, almost tentative at first, then settling into a gentle rhythm that did not disrupt the atmosphere, but flowed alongside it, marking time without defining it. Naomi reached for the tray she had set down earlier, her fingers closing around its edge with the same quiet precision as before, and for a brief second, the reflection of the chandelier light traced across its surface again, catching the same small detail that had gone unnoticed earlier, now seen clearly by more than one pair of eyes. She did not rush. She did not linger. She simply lifted the tray and turned slightly, her movement calm, deliberate, as if nothing in her had changed, even though everything around her had. The guests did not step aside out of habit this time, but with awareness, creating space not because she was invisible, but because she was seen, and the difference, though subtle, was complete. Richard remained where he stood, watching as she moved, not with the certainty he had begun with, but with a quiet stillness that suggested something within him had shifted as well, something that did not yet have words, but no longer needed them to exist. And as Naomi walked toward the edge of the room, not leaving, not retreating, simply continuing, the balance that had redefined the space held steady behind her, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but grounded in a truth that had finally been allowed to surface. Naomi did not look back as she moved, her steps measured, unhurried, the soft sound of her shoes against the marble floor blending with the low return of music that now felt almost distant, as if the room itself had shifted into a quieter awareness of everything unfolding within it. The tray in her hands remained steady, the reflection of light across its surface no longer sharp, but diffused, like something that had lost its edge and settled into calm. Behind her, the space she left did not close in the same way it had before, It remained open, not as a gap, but as a reminder of where attention had been redirected, where something had been seen and could not be unseen. Richard Whitmore stood still for a moment longer, his gaze following her movement, not with authority, not with dismissal, but with a stillness that suggested something internal had shifted beyond his immediate control. The people around him did not return to him as they once would have, did not wait for his next word to define the moment, and that absence of expectation settled into the air in a way that felt unfamiliar, even to those who could not fully name it. A man near the front turned slightly toward Richard, his expression thoughtful rather than deferential, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tone that had changed from earlier in the evening. "We should probably revisit how contributions are credited moving forward," he said, not as a challenge, but as a statement grounded in what had just been revealed. Another guest nodded quietly, her gaze shifting between Richard and the direction Naomi had gone, as if measuring the distance not just in space, but in meaning. Richard inhaled slowly, his shoulders remaining squared, but the effort behind that posture now visible in the subtle tension along his frame. He adjusted his cuff again, the same precise motion from earlier, but it no longer carried the same ease, no longer functioned as a dismissal, but as a small attempt to re-establish control over something that no longer responded the same way. "That can be arranged," he said, his voice measured, composed, but quieter, the certainty still present, yet tempered by what had unfolded. The words did not carry the room as they once would have. They existed, acknowledged, but not defining. Daniel Reeves watched from where he stood, his expression calm, his attention no longer fixed on directing the moment, but on observing its conclusion, as if understanding that the shift had already reached its natural point. Near the edge of the ballroom, Naomi paused briefly beside a service table, setting the tray down with the same controlled motion she had used before, her fingers releasing the edge without hesitation. A server nearby glanced at her, then away, then back again, not out of uncertainty, but recognition, as if seeing her clearly for the first time and adjusting accordingly. Naomi did not linger there. She straightened, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to look across the room, not searching for anything, not holding on to the moment, simply acknowledging the space as it now was. The chandeliers above cast a softer glow than before, or perhaps it only felt that way, their light no longer sharp against the surfaces, but warmer, more even, as if the tension that had once defined the room had dissolved into something quieter, more grounded. Richard remained where he was, but the center had shifted, not dramatically, not with noise, but with certainty that no longer belonged to him alone. And in that quiet, measured stillness, the room continued, not as it had begun, but as something subtly, permanently changed, held together not by power, but by the simple, undeniable presence of truth that had finally been seen. The room did not return to what it had been, even as conversation slowly resumed in fragments around the edges, quieter, more measured, as if everyone present had become aware of something they could not easily set aside. The music continued, but it no longer filled the space in the same way, instead moving gently beneath the surface, like a current that carried the evening forward without trying to define it. Naomi Carter stood near the service table, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged, yet the stillness around her felt different now, not isolating, but grounded, as if she occupied the space with a presence that no longer needed to be questioned. A guest approached her slowly, not with urgency, but with intention, his steps deliberate, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice respectful, the formality of her name spoken clearly, without hesitation, and the way he addressed her carried a quiet shift that did not go unnoticed. Naomi turned slightly toward him, her gaze steady, her expression calm, and for a brief moment, the interaction existed outside the larger room, contained, simple, real. "Your work," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "It made a difference that we did not fully understand until now." The acknowledgement did not seek forgiveness, did not attempt to repair the past. It simply recognized the truth as it stood, and that honesty gave it weight. Naomi inclined her head slightly, not as a gesture of submission, but acknowledgement, her response measured, unforced. It was meant to, she said, her tone even, and in that simplicity, there was no need for elaboration. Nearby, another guest paused, then stepped closer, drawn not by curiosity, but by something quieter, something more grounded. One by one, without coordination, without announcement, people began to approach her, not forming a line, not crowding, but shifting their attention in a way that placed her at the center of a different kind of space, one defined not by status, but by recognition. Richard Whitmore watched from where he stood, the distance between them unchanged in feet, yet altered in meaning, and for the first time, he did not move to close it immediately. His gaze followed the small interactions, the subtle exchanges, and something in his expression softened, not fully, not completely, but enough to suggest that the certainty he had relied on had been replaced by something more reflective. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if reconsidering, as if understanding that movement alone would not return him to where he had been. The glass in his hand remained untouched, the condensation. Along its surface catching the light in faint streaks that traced slowly downward, marking time in a way that felt more noticeable than before. Daniel Reeves shifted slightly to the side, creating space without drawing attention to it, his role complete, his presence now part of the background rather than the focus. Naomi listened as another guest spoke, her attention present, her responses minimal, not out of reluctance, but because she did not need to fill the space with more than what was necessary. The conversations around her were quiet, sincere, grounded in what had been revealed rather than what had been assumed, and the difference carried through each word, each glance, each pause. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing by a fraction, and when he finally moved again, it was not with the same certainty as before, but with intention that felt more measured, more aware. He took a step toward Naomi, then another, the distance closing gradually, not as a reclaiming of space, but as an approach shaped by understanding rather than control. The room did not shift to accommodate him this time, did not realign itself around his movement, and that absence of reaction marked the change more clearly than anything else. Naomi remained where she was, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, and as Richard drew closer, the moment did not sharpen into tension, but settled into something quieter, something that no longer required dominance or resistance, only acknowledgement. And in that quiet approach, the final shape of the evening began to form, not in a dramatic turn, but in a slow, undeniable redefinition of what it meant to be seen, to be heard, and to stand in a room that had finally learned the difference. Richard Whitmore stopped just short of where Naomi Carter stood, the final few feet between them no longer something he could cross without intention, and for a moment, he did not speak, as if understanding that whatever came next would not be carried by the room in the way his words once had been. The conversations around them softened, not completely fading, but lowering just enough that the space between them felt distinct, not isolated, but defined, as though the air itself had drawn a boundary that could not be ignored. Naomi turned slightly toward him, her movement unhurried, her expression unchanged, and when their eyes met, there was no tension in it, no resistance, only a quiet presence that held steady without needing to assert itself. Richard inhaled, the breath measured, controlled, but not entirely steady, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a tone that had not been present earlier in the evening, something quieter, something more deliberate. "Miss Carter," he said, the formality of her name placed carefully, as if acknowledging something he had previously overlooked. "It seems I was not fully informed." The words did not attempt to undo what had been said before, did not reach back to correct the moment. They simply stood as they were, incomplete in their repair, but honest in their recognition. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and the absence of reaction did not diminish the weight of what he had said. It allowed it to exist fully, without resistance or acceptance shaping it into something else. A faint pause followed, longer than expected, and in that space, the subtle sounds of the room returned, the distant clink of glass, the low hum of conversation, the soft movement of fabric, all of it grounding the moment in something real, something present. Richard's gaze lowered briefly, not in submission, but in thought, as if searching for words that did not come as easily as they once had, and when he looked back at her, There was a shift, slight but unmistakable, in the way he held her presence. Your work, he continued, choosing the phrase with care, has had a significant impact on this firm. The statement was measured, professional, yet it carried something more than acknowledgement, something that suggested an understanding forming in real time, not complete, not resolved, but moving in that direction. Naomi inclined her head slightly, the gesture minimal, not performative, simply an acknowledgement of what had been said, and when she spoke, her voice remained even, steady, unchanged. It was never about recognition, she said, her words clear, unforced, and the simplicity of the statement settled between them without needing further explanation. Richard held her gaze for a moment longer, as if absorbing that, as if measuring it against the framework he had operated within for so long, and for the first time, he did not immediately respond. Around them, the room continued to move, conversations picking up again in small clusters, but the attention near them remained quiet, observant, as if witnessing something that did not require interruption. Daniel Reeves stood at a distance, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral, allowing the exchange to unfold without influence, as though understanding that this moment belonged solely to the two people at its center. Richard shifted his stance slightly, the movement subtle, but it marked a change, not in position, but in approach, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less structure, less control, more presence. Then perhaps, he said slowly, it should be. The words did not land as a command, not as a directive, but as a suggestion shaped by what had already been revealed, and the difference was clear in the way they settled into the space, not reshaping it, but aligning with it. Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her gaze softened, not dramatically, not in a way that altered her presence, but enough to suggest that the shift had been seen, acknowledged, and understood for what it was. She did not step closer, did not step back. She simply remained where she was, grounded, steady, and in that stillness, the moment found its balance, not through resolution, but through recognition, leaving behind a quiet understanding that did not erase what had happened, but redefined what would come after. Naomi Carter did not answer right away, and the space between them held steady, not tense, not uncertain, but complete in a way that did not require anything more to define it. The music continued in the background, soft strings moving through the air with a quiet consistency, and the low murmur of conversation resumed around the edges of the room, no longer avoiding the moment, but flowing alongside it as something already understood. Richard Whitmore remained where he stood, his posture no longer rigid, no longer shaped by the need to assert, but by a stillness that suggested he was no longer trying to control what had already moved beyond him. Naomi's gaze rested on him for a brief second longer, then shifted, not dismissing him, not rejecting the exchange, but allowing it to settle into its natural place without forcing it further. A server passed nearby, offering a tray of drinks, and this time, when Naomi reached for a glass, the movement was simple, unguarded, her fingers closing around the stem with ease, as if the room had returned to something ordinary, even though nothing about it was the same. A few guests nearby watched the small gesture, not because it was significant on its own, but because it marked a transition, a quiet return to motion after something that had changed the entire atmosphere. Richard followed the movement, his gaze lowering briefly to the glass in her hand, then lifting again, and for the first time, there was no attempt to reshape the moment, no effort to reclaim ground that had already shifted. He nodded once, the gesture subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that did not need words, an acknowledgement not just of her role, but of what had been revealed about himself in the process. Naomi inclined her head in return, equally minimal, not accepting or rejecting, simply recognizing the moment for what it was. Around them, the room continued to move, conversations reforming, laughter returning in small, careful bursts, but the tone had changed, quieter, more aware, as if something deeper had settled beneath the surface. Daniel Reeves stepped closer to a group nearby, his voice low as he resumed conversation, no longer central, no longer needed to direct attention, and the ease with which he did so reflected the new balance that had formed. Naomi took a small step back, then another, not retreating, but repositioning herself within the space, her presence no longer defined by where she stood, but by how she had been seen. The light from the chandeliers above cast a warm glow across the room now. Or perhaps it only felt warmer, the earlier sharpness replaced by something softer, more even, as if the atmosphere itself had adjusted to the shift that had taken place. Richard remained still for a moment longer, then turned slightly, not away from her, but toward the room, his gaze moving across the guests, no longer as a point of command, but as part of the space he once defined. The distance between them remained, but it no longer carried the same meaning, no longer marked separation, but transformation. Naomi lifted the glass slightly, not in a toast, not in a gesture meant to be seen, but simply as part of the rhythm of the evening, and as she did, her reflection caught briefly in the surface of a nearby mirror, steady, composed, unchanged. She did not need to say anything more. She did not need to prove anything further. The room had already shifted, already learned, already adjusted to a truth that could not be undone. And as the evening moved forward, quiet and steady, it carried with it the shape of that moment, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something lasting, something that remained even after the words had faded, even after the attention had moved on, something that stayed in the way people looked, in the way they listened, in the way they understood what it meant for someone to belong, not because they were allowed to, but because they always had. The evening continued, but it no longer carried the same assumptions it had begun with, and that difference settled into the smallest details, into the way conversations paused just a second longer before shifting, into the way eyes lingered with a little more awareness, as if everyone present had recalibrated something they could not fully name. Naomi Carter stood near the edge of the room now, the glass in her hand untouched, her posture relaxed but steady, and the reflection of the chandeliers moved softly across its surface as she turned it slightly between her fingers. She was no longer at the center, yet the space she had occupied did not close behind her. It remained open in memory, in perception, in the quiet understanding that had reshaped the room. A man approached her again, not hurried, not hesitant, his expression thoughtful, and when he spoke, his tone carried none of the distance that had defined the earlier part of the night. "If you are available next week," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we would value your perspective directly." The offer was simple, not grand, not exaggerated, but it carried something that had not been there before, recognition not filtered through hierarchy, but given as it was. Naomi met his gaze, her expression calm, her response measured. "If the work requires it," she said, and the answer was not acceptance or refusal, it was alignment, grounded in purpose rather than position. The man nodded, understanding the weight of that, and stepped back, not dismissed, but acknowledged, his place in the room unchanged, yet informed by what had shifted. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore stood near a group that had begun to disperse, his presence still significant, still recognized, but no longer unquestioned, and that difference rested quietly in the way people addressed him, in the slight pauses before responding, in the absence of automatic agreement. He listened more now, spoke less, and when he did, his words carried a deliberation that had not been necessary before. His gaze moved once more across the room, finding Naomi again, not searching, not assessing, simply noticing, and this time, he did not look away quickly. There was no urgency in the glance, no attempt to resolve anything further, just an acknowledgement that remained where it was. Naomi did not hold his gaze long. She shifted her attention to the window beyond the room, where the city lights stretched out in quiet patterns, steady and distant, each one holding its place without needing to compete for attention. The glass reflected part of the ballroom behind her, the movement, the light, the subtle interactions continuing as the evening settled into its new rhythm. A server passed beside her, offering a small nod that carried familiarity rather than formality, and she returned it just as simply. The exchange quiet, natural, unremarkable in its simplicity, yet shaped by everything that had come before. The music softened again, the tempo slowing slightly, and the conversations around the room adjusted to match it, no longer carrying the sharp edges of earlier tension, but moving with a steadier flow. Naomi placed the glass gently on the table beside her, her fingers releasing it without hesitation, and she drew a slow breath, not from relief, not from exhaustion, but from a calm that had always been there, now unobstructed. Richard remained across the room, still part of the space, still present, but no longer defining it. And in that quiet distance, something had shifted permanently, not just in how he was seen, but in how he saw. The room held that change without needing to speak it, without needing to mark it as an event. And as the night continued, it did so with a new kind of balance, one that did not rely on control or assumption, but on a quieter, more enduring understanding that had settled into place and would not easily be undone. The night did not end with applause or announcement, and nothing in the room demanded a conclusion, yet something had already settled into place that made an ending unnecessary. Naomi Carter stood by the window for a moment longer, her reflection faint against the glass, layered over the quiet geometry of city lights stretching out beyond the ballroom, steady and indifferent to everything that had just unfolded. Inside, the music continued its gentle rhythm, and the conversations moved forward, no longer circling what had happened, but carrying it quietly within them, shaping the tone without overtaking it. Naomi turned from the window with the same calm she had carried all evening, her movements unhurried, her posture steady, and as she stepped away from the table, there was no hesitation in her stride, no pause to look back, no need to measure what had changed because she already understood it. A server passed her, offering a small, genuine nod, not out of duty, but recognition, and she returned it just as simply, the exchange brief but complete in its meaning. The ballroom behind her remained full, yet different, not in its appearance, but in the way it held itself, as if something invisible had shifted its foundation. Across the room, Richard Whitmore stood near the same place he had occupied earlier, but he no longer held the room in the same way, and he seemed to know it. His posture was still composed, his presence still notable, yet the certainty that once surrounded him had softened into something quieter, something more reflective. And as he watched Naomi move toward the exit, he did not call out, did not step forward, did not attempt to interrupt the direction she had chosen. He simply observed, his gaze steady, his expression thoughtful, as if understanding that this moment did not belong to him to reshape. Daniel Reeves caught that glance from a distance, then looked away, not dismissing it, but allowing it to exist without commentary, his own role in the evening now fully complete. Naomi reached the edge of the room where the lighting dimmed slightly, where the polished floor gave way to a quieter corridor, and as she stepped across that threshold, the sound of the ballroom softened behind her, fading not abruptly, but gradually, like something that had already served its purpose. Her steps remained even, her breathing steady, and the faint scent of polished wood and clean linen followed her into the hallway, grounding the moment in something real, something tangible. Behind her, the door did not close with a sound that marked departure. It simply settled back into place, leaving the ballroom intact, yet undeniably changed. Richard remained inside, standing within a space that had once moved in alignment with him, now holding its own balance without requiring his direction, and for the first time, he did not try to reclaim it. He glanced once more toward the place where Naomi had stood earlier, now empty, yet not forgotten, and in that empty space, there was no absence, only the quiet imprint of something that had redefined what it meant to be seen. Naomi continued down the corridor without slowing, her reflection briefly passing across a framed mirror on the wall, steady, composed, unchanged, and as she moved beyond it, the image disappeared, leaving only the path ahead, clear and uninterrupted. She did not need recognition to carry forward, did not need the room behind her to confirm what had already been true, and in that quiet certainty, the night reached its natural close, not with a statement, not with a final word, but with a simple, enduring understanding that did not need to be spoken to remain. He had said she did not belong, but in the end, she was the only one who never needed the room to prove that she did.